The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am wrapping up my review of the player cards from the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack with a look at the Survivor and Neutral cards. I've split up the review, as you're probably aware by now, so make sure you check out the reviews for all the other classes. There are some really great cards in this pack. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing, and if you enjoy what you hear, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. With that in mind, let's see what the designers have in store for the game's Survivors. The first Survivor card in the pack is a one-cost event. This is Fight or Flight. It has the Spirit trait and the game text Fast. Play only during your turn. Until the end of the round, you get +X combat and +X agility, where X is the amount of horror on you. Now, Fight or Flight is virtually identical to Mind Over Matter, a Seeker event from the core set. The key difference between them being that the Fight or Flight's bonuses depend on the amount of horror on your investigator, rather than using your investigator's intellect in place of their combat and agility. It's also worth noting, I think, that Fight or Flight doesn't have any skill icons. There are only two other non-permanent Survivor cards with no icons, both of which are lucky from the core set. Cards without skill icons can come back to bite you in the ass from time to time if they happen to be the only card in your hand and you really need to pitch them to a skill test. And I would be rather wary of putting this card in a MINH deck, for example, which really prizes cards for their skill icons. Fight or Flight is it's the latest card the designers have released that keys off the amount of horror on your investigator. You'll remember the Echoes of the Past Mythos pack contained a set of desperate skills which added 4 skill icons to the test as long as you only had 3 or fewer remaining sanity. And I was pretty down on the desperate skills as a whole, and Fight or Flight suffers from some of the same problems. Fight or Flight certainly has the potential to provide some exceptional bonuses to your combat and agility. However, it is essentially blank until you have at least one horror or you've sustained a mental trauma during a campaign. And you can't even pitch it to a skill test since it does lack skill icons. I don't really like playing with blank cards in my deck, and I really do my best to avoid or mitigate the amount of horror and mental trauma that I take when I play this game. So I don't really like the fact that Fight or Flight only you can't really rely on Fight or Flight to provide a bonus at the right time if you need it. I think Fight or Flight it's certainly a better card than the desperate skills because it is much easier to turn on. I'm just not sure whether it really fits with my playstyle. Now, it would be tempting to write it off, Fight or Flight off, along with the desperate skills. However, there is some new information that has come to light since my last review that has changed my perspective on these cards somewhat. Fantasy Flight Games recently announced Dim Carcosa, the final Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa cycle. And that announcement indicated that sanity would play a significant role in the scenario, so much so that investigators will not be defeated when they have horror equal to or greater than their sanity. Now that is extremely significant. It sounds like investigators will be very fortunate indeed to hang on to their sanity during this scenario, which is going to make a card like Fight or Flight or the desperate skills that much more appealing. The combat and agility bonuses provided by Fight or Flight could be anywhere from +5 to +8, depending on the investigator that you're playing, and that's insane if you're able to pull out a +8. You know, there aren't many cards besides some of the talents that offer those type of bonuses, and certainly not for one resource. I wasn't really excited by Fight or Flight when I first read the card. However, I think in light of the recent information that was dropped in the preview article, I'm going to be paying a lot more attention to this card when I sit down to build my Survivor deck for the Path to Carcosa campaign. I might even give the Desperate Skills a second look, since it sounds like sanity will be in very short supply toward the end of the cycle. Flight or Flight, that's a tongue twister almost. Fight or Flight can certainly provide some insane skill bonuses. The only question for me is, do they come at the right time? Because and how high will they be? You know. So that's something to keep in mind. The survivors received 2 cards with the EXILE clause in this expansion, the first of which is a Test of Will. It's a 1-cost event that costs 1 experience point and has the Spirit trait. It has the game text fast. Play when an investigator at your location draws a non-weakness treachery card. Cancel that card's revelation effect. Exile Test of Will. Now those of you out there who have played the Lord of the Rings LCG will immediately recognize a Test of Will. It's a callback to a spirit card of the same name and roughly same ability from Fantasy Flight Games' first cooperative LCG. Even the art and the flavor text are somewhat similar to its Lord of the Rings counterpart. Now, one of the biggest gripes about the LOTR's LCG is that the Spirit Sphere was really the only one that had a reliable way to cancel treachery cards, which made Spirit very valuable, and players would really go out of their way to include Spirit cards in general, and a Test of Will in particular in their deck. Fortunately, the designers of the Arkham Horror LCG have learned from that mistake, and the ability to cancel treachery cards is becoming much more widely available to all the classes, and I expect to see more cards like this as the cycle continues. The Seeker class received Forewarned in this Mythos pack, while the Survivor class receives a Test of Will. Both cost an experience point, but a Test of Will is going to set you back a resource to play. A Test of Will may cost more, but it allows you to cancel any non-weakness treachery card at your location, making it slightly more versatile than Forewarned, which will only cancel a treachery card that you draw. Unfortunately, this versatility comes at a price. You need to exile a Test of Will after you play it. Now, the exile mechanic was introduced in the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack, and it's currently found on only Survivor cards. Basically, if you play a card with exile, you need to remove it not only from the game, but also from your deck. If you want to include the card in your deck again, you must purchase it again with experience points. That means a survivor can spend a lot of his or her experience repurchasing cards. However, most survivor upgrades are fairly cheap. I don't think they have an upgrade that costs more than 3. So theoretically, you should have plenty of experience available to upgrade the cards you want and repurchase those cards that you exiled during a scenario. Now, I've tended to avoid the exile cards for the most part. The only one that I've played is Stroke of Luck, a survivor skill from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack, because it has such a powerful ability, and it did guarantee a victory in Lost in Time of Space, so I didn't really mind exiling it, since it's the last scenario of the campaign anyway. A Test of Will's ability is also very powerful, so I really don't have a problem with the exile clause. You'll want to save it for a treachery that's going to wreck your game, but sometimes that's not so obvious. So familiarizing yourself with the treachery cards in the encounter deck is really going to help you make the best choice, and best choice for which one to cancel with a Test of Will. I suspect that a Test of Will is going to find its way into most survivor decks at some point during the campaign. I don't think Agnes is all that interested in it, since she can play Ward of Protection, which synergizes with her special ability to do extra damage. MINH has the option of purchasing Forewarned or a Test of Will. If I had to make a choice between the two, I'd probably pick Forewarned. Of course, she could always double down on Treachery Cancellation and play both, and really try to put a stranglehold on the encounter deck. That leaves Wendy Adams, Ashcan Pete, and William York. I've seen a few Ashcan Pete decks that play Ward of Protection, and I certainly played it in the Ashcan Pete I've played on the channel before. So I could see those Ashcan Pete decks making the switch to a Test of Will, just to free up some of those out-of-class card slots that are very precious for those Dunwich investigators. You know, a Test of Will is one of those cards that really defines the Lord of the Rings LCG, and I expect its Arkham Horror LCG counterpart is going to do the same. You know, there's really no feeling quite like canceling a treachery card that's about to destroy you. And a Test of Will gives you the option to cancel any non-weakness treachery card at your location. So it's not just you, but your fellow investigators who will love you if you happen to have one of these in your hand at the right time. I really hate the idea of having to repurchase the card every time I play it, but you know, I can understand why the designers felt the need to balance it, and I just hope that experience points remain plentiful and those survivor upgrades remain cheap, so you can continue to pick up this card when you need it. The third survivor card in the pack also comes with the Exile clause. This is Devil's Luck. It's a one-cost event that costs 1 experience point. It has an agility skill icon and the fortune trait. It has the game text Fast. Play when you are dealt damage and or horror. Cancel up to 10 damage and or horror just dealt to you. Exile Devil's Luck. Whoa, that's a lot of damage and horror. I don't really want to see what can do that amount of damage and horror that requires a card like this. I do expect Exile cards to have powerful abilities, and Devil's Luck certainly fits that bill. The last time we saw a card with this type of effect was I've Had Worse, the Guardian event from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack. It costs 4 experience points, but it only cancelled up to 5 damage and or horror. However, it did give you resources for each point of damage and horror it cancelled, so the higher experience point cost was justified. I think Devil's Luck is really the survivor's oh shit button. There aren't many in the cards in the game that do 10 damage and or horror, but when it happens, you're going to be happy to have Devil's Luck in your hand. The most obvious card that comes to mind is Beyond the Veil from the Dunwich Legacy. You know, few investigators could survive a Beyond the Veil trigger if it went off, and Devil's Luck certainly solves that problem. Fortunately, there are very few enemies that come close to doing that much damage and or horror. The worst of them top out at 6, and most of those are either bosses or one-offs in the encounter deck. So if you've ever wanted to go toe-to-toe with UMORDHOTH in the Devourer below, now's your chance. A Devil's Luck will buy you at least 1 turn, so you can wail away on that Ancient One to your heart's content. Devil's Luck is the only card in the Survivor arsenal that can cancel damage and or horror outright, and I think that alone makes it worth a look when you're building your deck. However, it is currently overkill against most of the treacheries and enemies currently in the game, which means you may want to consider it on a scenario-to-scenario basis, especially toward the end of a campaign when the stakes are a little higher and the enemies get that much tougher. If you're thinking about playing this card, you're either on the verge of losing or about to lose, so exiling it really is the least of your worries. The final card in this Mythos pack is a neutral event, Calling in Favors. It costs 1 resource and has an intellect and agility icon. It has the favor trait and the game text. Choose an ally asset you control and return it to your hand. Then search the top 9 cards of your deck for an ally asset and play it, reducing its cost by X. X is the cost of the ally asset. Return to your hand. Shuffle your deck. Now, there are very few tutors in the Arkham Horror LCG, and only one that specifically targets allies, that being Flare. an event from the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack. There are really only a handful of investigators who can play Flare, since it costs 1 experience point. So unless you've got access to Seeker cards like Old Book of Lore and No Stone Unturned, calling in favors is really your only option if you need a specific ally in a hurry. Unfortunately, you need to have an ally in play, which sort of limits calling in favors' usefulness to some extent. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of amazing things you can do with a couple of allies and a copy or two of calling in favors in your deck. Oddly enough, investigators with access to cards in the Seeker class are probably in the best position to play calling in favors, since the class has so many allies with Enters Plays effects. Art Student, Laboratory Assistant, and Research Librarian all have effects that trigger once they enter play, and at which point they basically become warm bodies that are just waiting to soak some damage and horror for you. Calling in favors lets you bounce them back to your hand to search for somebody more useful. You know, Daisy Walker, for example, she could play a Research Art Librarian to grab a tome, and then bounce him back to her hand to play Dr. Mylan Christopher from her deck for just 2 resources. And that's pretty good. Roland Banks can pull off the same trick, playing an art student to grab a clue, then bouncing it back to his hand with calling in favors to play Brother Xavier for 3 resources. Roland can play the art student later in the game if Brother Xavier dies, or he needs to grab a clue at a high shroud location he just has no answer for. If the scenario is roughing up Brother Xavier, Roland could always bounce him back to his hand with calling in favors and replay him good as new. Investigators with the access to Seeker cards aren't the only ones who can have fun with calling in favors. Agnes could play calling in favors to bounce an Arcane Initiate back to hand after searching for a spell, removing a Doom from play, and then play Peter Sylvester from her deck for 2 resources. Or she could return either of those allies to her hand to play the Red-Gloved Man from the Lost in Time and Space Mythos pack at a discount, and that Red-Gloved Man is extremely powerful, and you could certainly tutor him up this way. And you can't forget about Ashcan Pete, who starts with an ally in play. Ashcan can bounce Duke back to his hand to search his deck for Peter Sylvester and play him for 1 resource. And he can always play Luke later that turn or on the next turn. If Duke is in danger of going to Doggy Heaven, Ashcan can use calling in favors to bounce his prize pooch back to his hand to replay him reinvigorated. I think calling in favors is a really exciting card that is only going to get better as more allies are released. The ability to abuse allies with Enters Play effects, exchange an ally for one that is better for the board state, or effectively heal an injured ally by bouncing it back to your hand is really fantastic. Competition for the ally slot is fierce, and calling in favors ensures you get the most out of it if you don't want to spend the experience on charisma. And I can't wait to see this card taken for a spin in a bunch of different decks. That's going to do it for my review of the Survivor and Neutral cards in the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack. I think Survivor made off really well in this pack. Fight or Flight has the potential for some to be extremely powerful later this cycle, while a Test of Will is going to find a home in just about every deck that can take it. Devil's Luck is overkill most of the time, but it is going to save your ass when it counts. There is only 1 neutral card, but man, it's a good one. Calling in favors creates all sorts of interesting plays with allies, and it's only going to get better as more allies are released for this game. Overall, I was disappointed with the Echoes of the Past Mythos pack, so I'm really happy that the Unspeakable Oath is a return to form. There are a lot of cards in this pack I want to play with, so I'm going to stop talking and get back to deck building. That's going to do it for my review. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Do you agree or disagree with my analysis of the cards? Please leave a comment down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to contact me, you can reach me at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.